Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening to you, Corrine, out in Mauritius. That was our friend Craig Taubman in a
Hi.
different time of his career, the 80s. You can even hear the 80s in the music. Sounds like one of those movies, those flicks from the 80s with that kind of electric drum. Shir Ladonai Kol Haaretz, Shir Ladonai Shechadash, from Psalms 96. Appropriate for our topic today about spreading the new word, the new interpretation of how to worship Adonai in this chapter of Acts, which I have it on good authority as one of Steve's favorite stories of Cornelius. Could you profile the stained window again, Madalena? Let's see if I can do it.
Hey,
Here we go. I got it. So as you can see, we've got well, that's Cornelius on the right bowing down. Let's leave it at that, and two of his guys, and and we'll get to the rest of the story. Perhaps we'll bring it up afterwards as well. Don't have any attribute. I just found this on the internet. This particular stained glass window. Of course, it's a common image in Christian iconography. And let's hear more about the story. Okay, we Steve, did you have anything you wanted to add for us from last week that we probably left out?
Um, yeah, I'm sorry I had to go to Mexico. I had to go to Sayulita to be with my son, and I'm being facetious. It was a great trip, and it was real privileged to parachute into his world and let him show us around. But sorry I missed last week. Uh, as I've reviewed and I listened to the conversation y'all had last week, I a couple of things strike me as context for getting into chapter 10. And the thing is, there's just so many layers of first century Judaism that are coming into play. And so these Jewish Christians who are also divided into four different groups in terms of their relationship to the law. They really feel they have that conviction, they have that experience that in Jesus of Nazareth, carpenter turned rabbi, God did something new, that God ushered in the beginning of the age to come that would be characterized by healing and by health and by forgiveness and all the things that good Jews in the first century were hoping for, longing for. And so this new thing in Jesus of Nazareth obviously got passed on to his learners, his disciples, his apprentices, who in turn become sent out and as apostles. And in the beginning, as we've gone over and over, it was confined to Judea, to Jerusalem. And there were some non-Christian Jews who tolerated that. There were some other more conservative Jews who rejected that new movement. But at the heart of this new movement is this idea of koinonia, this idea of fellowship, of a communion, partners. And as we'll see in today's story, this new koinonia is almost the thing itself. It's this precious new covenant with this community that begins to expand outside of the confines of Jerusalem. And as we saw in the past few weeks, it moves into Samaria, and this expansion of this new community, this koinonia, is always characterized by the coming of the Holy Spirit in a new way. So every time the Holy Spirit shows up, you can be sure that something new is happening. A new peoples are being incorporated into the koinonia, into the fellowship. And so where we left off last week, we found Saul, who will become Paul. Saul Paul, his Hebrew and then his Roman name. He has disappeared from sight. He faced lots of persecution from the so-called Hellenistic Jews. And while some Hellenists, Greek-speaking Jews, were open to the Jewish Christian movement, others who were converts to Judaism tended to have the zeal of a new believer, if you will, and they were scandalized by Paul's conversion and by his new message, and they push back. So it's multi-layered, and depending on where we are, it really depends. Last thing I'll say is that Peter then ends up on the Mediterranean coast at Lydda, and there's a healing, the healing of Aeneas. There's the raising of Dorcas or Tabitha, raising from the dead. And that same word, anastasis, that is used of Jesus as being raised from death, is used of the raising of Dorcas. And so it's a resurrection of sorts. It's of that type. And the message that comes across is that these apostles, these Jews who become apostles of their master Jesus, they've been given this exousia, this power by the Spirit, which comes from deep within. It's the same power that Jesus is seen to have had in the gospel stories. And now they're passing it on. And as Jesus said in John, the Gospel of John, in the upper room before he was arrested and crucified, he said, "What I've done, you'll do too." And I do nothing alone. Everything I do, with the Father. And you're going to do even greater things than I have done. And so if I can do it, you can do it too, as my partners. And so now we see this being manifest, this new covenant community that is very complicated and includes lots of layers of different kinds of people, and now from different geographical places. And today that really is brought home with Cornelius. And so that's all I'll say, David, just by way of introduction.
Great, and thank you. Just a little bit, my reflections in reading and preparing today is I want us to remember the previous story about the Ethiopian eunuch, a similar kind of a story, and maybe competition of sorts for who was the first outside the first Gentile convert, maybe, although we'll remember that seems that he was already converted to Judaism, but wasn't born a Jew. So we'll go back and talk about that with the time. And also to think of the geography that we have, Lod or Lydia is close to the coast, but not on the coast. It's on the way from Jerusalem. Then Jaffa is literally on the coast. And now he's going up to Caesarea or Caesarea. which is not only on the coast, but it is most definitively a not Jewish city. It's a Roman city. It's where that was the capital of the Roman government, and so it's so to speak moving away from the core area of Jerusalem. Even Samaria is still part of that general area, moving down towards the coast, and then up to really not necessarily out of the land, but out of the Jewish culture. I think that's in the background of this as well. Okay, so would somebody like to read first section for us? Oh, and I have to say, do we have Roman Catholics? Don, are you Roman Catholic? Or you were? So
No.
did you know that today is Cornelius's feast in the
Yeah.
Roman Catholic? So this is only appropriate, and we beg we're sorry to the Episcopalians amongst us. We know that your Cornelius Day is in February, and I think the Orthodox have it another day in September. But today it's as we'd say in Hebrew, Mina Shamayim. It's Basheret. It's from the heaven that we're studying this story on this particular day, at least from a Roman Catholic point of view. So, in your honor, so Don, because you are our Roman Catholic here, there might be others, but why don't you begin reading?
I left the church for some non related reasons, but I am a Congregationalist now. But I will read verse 10 on to how far do you want me to go, to 17 or to 9?
Why don't we take it to 9, and then we'll see. Let's take it a bit at a time.
In Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of the Italian cohort, as it was called. He was a devout man who feared God with all his household. He gave alms generously to the people and prayed constantly to God. One afternoon, about 3 o'clock, he had a vision in which he clearly saw an angel of God coming in and saying to him, "Cornelius." He stared at him in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" He answered, "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa for a certain Simon, who is called Peter. He is lodging with Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the seaside." When the angel who spoke to him had left, he called 2 of his slaves and a devout soldier from the ranks of those who served him. And after telling them everything, he sent them to Joppa.
Okay. So you want to first crack at comments?
Well, it seems like here's a man that wants to be on the right side of God, is aligned with God. He has prayer. He has a sense of mysticality. He's obedient. I don't know what else one can say about him. I do know that tanners dealt with both clean and unclean animals, so it's significant that that he's talking or he's lodging with Simon the tanner.
Okay, interesting. Although it's not Cornelius, but it is interesting. Yeah, of course, that Peter is with him. Anybody else?
I have a question. The first line says a centurion of the Italian cohort. I'm not totally sure what that means.
Steve?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I take it as one of the, in the Roman hierarchy of soldiers, part of that system.
Yeah,
but I haven't drilled down into specifics, Ajit.
Yeah, it could
Richard?
be pretty high up, wasn't it? Like a commander, or like would be equivalent to a brigadier general, low-ranking general, which is or a colonel, pretty high up, and to be, I guess, a Christian Jew in the Roman army. That seemed odd to me.
Right. So I think that's the point of the story, to show that he's not some schlepper. He's not the guy that carries the cannons, or that fixes the tents to the horses. He's a ranking. My understanding of this would be, it's kind of like saying he's he's in, what do you call it? He's a Navy SEAL, or he's in Delta Force or something, and he's high up there, prestigious, because he's removed from we would think of the ones that are going to flock to be this arhoi polloi, the people themselves, who have no, he has standing, and he has a calling, and we also know he has standing because he has slaves and he has people under him who he's sending. But even though he was called, and I think this is significant, he sends others instead of him, and I'll get back to that in a few minutes, but there's a few comments though. Don?
I Googled Italian cohort. It's the name of an archery unit of the Roman army to which the Gentile centurion Cornelius belonged. So
Okay.
it was a specialty unit, much like probably the SEALs, Navy SEALs.
Okay. And somebody else had their hand up. No. Okay.
Well, I would just like to, I think Luke's community, who is writing this text, clearly gives us an image of a powerful person high up on the food chain, who nonetheless has humble heart. And there's a technical word, phubemenoi, which is used in verse 2. He was a devout man who feared God. That was a technical class of people called the God-fearers, those who had reverence, those who had a sense of awe in the face of the mystery. So he's as Don said, he's mystical, he's humble of heart, he's open, he's devout with Jewish piety. And the God-fearers typically were those who respected Judaism and the monotheist vision of God, who nonetheless did not want to become Jewish, or at least not through circumcision.
Right. Yeah, so that's the important distinction, Richard, that on the cusp of Judaism, but not Jewish per se. Right, and the Ethiopian who had been to Jerusalem, I'm back to that story for a second. It seems like he was a convert as well, but he was also on the cusp. If we remember in the story, he asked him, Philip asked him, "Do you even know what you're reading? Do you even understand what you're reading?" And then there's a baptism involved in that story. So there are people on the cusp. The difference is the Ethiopian was also high up, I guess, but he's also a soldier. We looked last week, Steve, at the story of Elisha, or Elisha, perhaps you pronounce, resurrecting or bringing back the boy. And there's also, in the whole Elijah/Elisha stories, there's much more in Elisha. There's questions about hierarchy. In that story, Elisha sent Gehazi, his boy, his student, to do something, and it couldn't be done at this always this question about who does what and who do you delegate to. It's like, when you want to get in touch with somebody and you get their assistant or their answering machine, you never get through to them, you're handled. And so what strikes me here is that although he was God-fearing, although he did all these things, and he had his own experience with godliness, he still sent somebody else instead of going on his own. Are there other comments before we go on?
Well, I think it's also glaring in the text that he's lodging with Simon, a tanner. So here's Peter, a good observant Jew, a Hebrew-speaking Jew, and or Aramaic, and he. It's shocking because the tanner, technically deals with unclean, animals that that a good observant Jew doesn't usually hang with.
So I might disagree on that one. There are laws about a tannery in the Mishnah. Tanneries were done. It's not that you can't touch an animal, which is not, you can't eat an animal. So people always say, how could you have somebody keep kosher who plays football? Football's with a pigskin, right? I think, but you can touch the stuff. You can make your living doing it as long as something wasn't used for idolatrous purposes, but you just can't eat it. So there's a little bit of confusion between touching and impurity and in what substance and what was work. But what you are right, see, he is at the tanners were at the low end, right? As I think they've been in most civilizations. Even when there's not an official caste system, it's not the people who have good educated. The people with graduate degrees don't go on to be tanners. Let's put it that way. So I think in that way, it's distinct.
Well, that's helpful, David, because also we'll see that eating comes into play here.
Exactly, and that's why it is. That's why whoever mentioned that it is interesting that I think Don that the tanner is mentioned here. He doesn't need to be mentioned because he was mentioned already last chapter, right? He was already in the story before, and he plays no part. Simon the tanner doesn't play a part in this story per se, but the mentioning of it, that whole issue of purity and impurity and what do you eat, what you don't, certainly comes up now. So why don't we continue to the next section? Ajit, would you like to read?
Sure.
Verse 9?
Verse 9. About noon the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, and while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heaven opened and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its four corners. In it were all kinds of four-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice say, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is so profane or unclean." The voice said to him again a second time, "What God had made clean, you must not call profane." This happened 3 times, and the whole thing was suddenly taken up to heaven.
Okay, so what do you say, Ajit? You ready to eat toads?
No, but I read this last night, and I more or less had the sense that the text of this gospel is now leaning in the direction of Paul instead of the Jewish laws of purity and impurity, what is pure and what is impure. Paul is emphasizing that there is no impurity. You don't need circumcision, etc. That this text is basically saying this is sanctioned. This is somewhat divinely sanctioned, that you don't have to be. You can eat the pork if you want to. You don't have to be circumcised if you don't want to. I think it's leaning in that direction. It's pushing in that direction.
Do you see a process of sorts? Because after all, we haven't heard much from Paul yet, right?
No, but recognizing that these books were compiled way after Paul, I kind of had the sense that yes, this is being written under the influence of Pauline doctrine.
I think. Yeah, go ahead, Don.
I've always felt this verse to be very confusing. I think, though, that what I can glean from it is that it starts to erode any particular prejudice that Peter may have one way or another. But this whole pericope, as they call them, is really difficult for me to understand.
Richard, did you hear him use the word pericope? Richard makes fun of me when I use words like pericope. He's not really sure they're words, but they are in biblical studies, right?
I used to know what this means, but I've forgotten.
It just means a passage, a particular literary unit. But when I was at Hebrew University and I was speaking in Hebrew but reading things in English, I just naturally assumed that you said pericope. Um, Steve, did you want to say something yet?
Well, just that you remember in we left Paul when he had come down to Jerusalem, and the apostles were slowly but surely accepting him and his story. And then he's arguing daily with the Hellenists. And as Raymond Brown, the great Roman Catholic scholar, would put it, that was the hyper-conservative Jew who had not Christian, but a convert to Judaism, who was real strict about the law. And apparently Paul was, as we just heard Don and Ajit say, was, suddenly, for the sake of bringing others into the koinonia, they start improvising. They're ad-libbing their relationship to the law, because the primary relationship is with the living God. And they all want to continue to be good Jews, right? But now we see Paul, he has to leave Jerusalem. They sneak him off to Caesarea and by the sea, and he goes off to Tarsus, and he spends another 3 years in Tarsus. So Paul's out of sight, out of mind. He'll pop back up. But remember, Paul is trying to make sense of that experience he had on the Damascus road. And so 14 years go by between his conversion and the first letter that he ever wrote. So Paul's down there, sorting things out. So now we go to Peter, and yes, it's true. It's a similar story in that Peter too is being forced to reckon with his own relationship to Judaism and the law, and what it means and for what reason. So
to my mind, this is done in a brilliant way. What's maybe confusing, it helps to know the book of Daniel. And while I didn't bring the passages in Daniel, this is extremely Daniel-esque, this whole scene here. First of all, he goes up on the roof to pray. Daniel looks out of his window in his upper story to pray as well. Daniel and being hungry and the food is an issue because Daniel and his friends, they won't eat the food and they bring them seeds and a vegetarian diet that the text in Daniel goes out of its way to talk about. So there's no doubt in my mind the author here wants us to think of Daniel. And then Daniel is the one who has these fantabulous visions, like this bizarre one here, the sheet, whatever the sheet symbolizes, and the four corners is part of Daniel talk as well, and Daniel visions, symbolizing globalization, so to speak, or globality. And these animals, these fantastic, when they're not described here, but it also doesn't say specific animals. You just can all sorts of imagine four-legged creatures and lizards and things, and that's why just a toad jumped into my mind. And all this is about food which was so central to saying how what a tzaddik, what a righteous Jew Daniel remained even in exile, a noble, righteous Jew, and all this is being undone in this little pericope here, this little story, by saying, no, this too is from God. To undo that is done in the same way that it was re-emphasized in Daniel. And then finally, in the book of Daniel, to my mind, is the nexus between temple-based Judaism and wisdom-based Judaism. Even though the book of Daniel wasn't written or edited until the 2nd century BCE, that is all parts of it, some of the older parts, but certainly the newer parts. The latest, the youngest book of the Hebrew Bible, many of the Second Temple books are still very much dealing with the temple itself and the centrality of the temple and living in Jerusalem or living in the Holy Land. Daniel is being a good Jew living abroad and showing his Judaism, so to speak, through wisdom. And to me, that's the parallel, and I think that explains a lot of the popularity of Daniel and New Testament authors. One, because it's closer to their time, but also because it kind of goes beyond. It goes beyond the constraints. Now, please, people often ask me, please don't understand. I am not saying that as a rabbi or as a Jew that this is what we need to do. For me in Judaism, I'm very much interested in preserving those rules, but I'm also interested in respecting those who have chosen not to preserve those rules and to find ways of doing things together the way we're doing it today. I make this disclaimer because about once a month, somebody who is in touch with us in Palm Springs, the first question is, are you a Messianic synagogue? Because they see in our stuff so much of this kind. They see the study we're doing. And that's all right. I'm not offended by it. But I do want to keep the categories relatively clear. So to me, that's the brilliance of this particular story here in being to undo it. And then finally, I will say, no, I won't say it yet. I'll have something to say about Peter versus Philip as well afterwards. Anything? Yes, please go ahead, Terry.
Okay, so my comment is this 3 business that Peter has to see the vision 3 times. Same vision, but 3 times. Peter was the one who denied Christ 3 times. After the resurrection, Jesus asked him 3 times, do you love me? And Peter had to reply 3 times. Seems like it takes Peter 3 times to get stuff. and maybe it's not only that. I'm thinking, didn't Jesus go and pray in the garden 3 times? There's something significant about that number 3.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only in Israelite Jewish tradition, in this tradition here, I think in many places around the world, 3 is a particular kind of thing. From a Jewish point of view, it's 3 times you have, 3 times is a chazakah, means that, for instance, if there's a custom that is not obligatory and you've kept it 3 times, then for you it's the law. That's based on Talmudic Judaism. It has a lot has to do with ownership issues. 3 times is certainty, and I think you're spot on here to see the connection between Peter here. In many ways, this is his repentance or his atonement, even kind of, right? His fixing his, yeah. Anybody else before we go on?
I love that Daniel connection, David.
Yeah,
That's really important, seems to me. And especially the earliest church appealed to Daniel 7, where with the Son of Man coming on the clouds, and they all often identified that with Jesus. So it resonates throughout. That's helpful for me.
Most people think, is what I've seen. Most people in New Testament study when Christian folk think of Daniel, they're thinking of Book of Revelation. Because the connections are really, really strong and profound. But I'm finding it more and more in other places as well, like here. Yes, Don?
In regard to Terry's comment, my Bible has those words in red. And in the Christian scriptures, the words of Jesus are denoted in red. So I haven't checked to see where those words were said, but it struck me that these words in Acts are highlighted in red, the same way that Jesus' sayings in the Gospels are highlighted in red.
Right. So it's the 3 times, and where are we up to? What verse did we get up to?
I'm sorry, the verse I was talking about was 13 and 15.
Right. So what verse have we gotten up? We're up to 17 now?
Yeah.
So now we'll see another usage of 3, which will be important. Terry, would you like to read?
Yes. Now, while Peter was greatly puzzled about what to make of the vision he had seen, suddenly the men sent by Cornelius appeared. They were asking for Simon's house and were standing by the gate. They called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Look, 3 men," there's that 3 again, "are searching for you. Now get up, go down, and go with them without hesitation, for I have sent them." So Peter went down to the men and said, I am the one you are looking for. What is the reason of your coming, for your coming? They answered, Cornelius, a centurion, a righteous and God-fearing man who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish people, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and to hear what you have to say. So Peter invited them in and gave them lodging.
Okay, 3 here and this, yes, Richard.
This is maybe, I don't know, geographical, but I'm a little confused. Peter was up on the roof. Did he see them at the gate from the roof? Is that what this is saying? Because how did he see them if he's on the roof and they're at the gate to the city?
There's 2 Peters, though.
No, while Peter was still telling you about it, the Spirit said to him, he says, look, see the men. Why don't you want to know how he saw them if he was on the roof?
Yes.
Oh, in Israel, and even to this day, but all the roofs are flat roofs. And they're roofs to live on, to which you could easily go on to park down and see who's down at the gate, who's down coming in the yard. I don't think that's a problem, really.
Oh, okay.
On your roof, it would be a problem. You'd probably fall and break your leg.
Except I had a neighbor who kept seeing horses on the roof of, not my house, but on a nearby house.
Okay.
So,
Oh, that's interesting. All right. Was it 3 horses?
It might have been a herd. I don't know, but I try to stay away from this person.
Okay.
But
It may be a bookie, Richard.
All right.
yeah,
So why 3? Why you Terry, you smiled at the 3-ness here, but it does it remind you of anything?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think that it's just this, again, the business of 3. So we have, like Peter responds to this sort of thing. It takes not 1 messenger, but 3 to convince him you need to go with these guys.
Okay. Don?
Melchizedek and the visitors who, in the Hebrew scriptures, the 3 people that visit.
Abraham, right, and the 3, and how that, by the way, becomes in later Christian interpretation, of course, and because those 3 turn out not to be men, but messengers of God, and even in that narrative in the Hebrew text, there at some point it becomes Adonai is speaking. It's a fascinating use of the narrative there, but that's for another time. But it's clear, and it was only natural afterwards that later Christianity would see in that the Trinity, the God's presence in that way. So perhaps here is where you need those 3 messengers in this godly work here, in this godly communication. Anything else before we go on?
I just want to point out while Peter was still thinking about the vision, he's ruminating, he's percolating, and then the Spirit speaks to him. And it just reminds me again of John in the upper room in those chapters 14 to 17, where Jesus says, I'm not going to leave you alone. The parakaleo, the one called to be come alongside you, the Holy Spirit will be my presence with you. So while again, it's code language for the post-resurrection Jesus continuing to speak as they are open to hear.
Absolutely. Okay, Jim, you want to read the next part?
The next day, he got up, this would be Peter, and went with them, and some of the brothers and sisters from Joppa accompanied him. The following day, they came to Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. On Peter's arrival, Cornelius met him and, falling at his feet, worshiped him. But Peter made him get up, saying, "Stand up, I'm only a mortal." As he talked with him, he went in and found that many had assembled, and he said to them, "You yourselves know that it is improper for a Jew to associate with or to visit an outsider. But God has shown me that I could not call anyone profane or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. Now, may I ask why you sent for me?"
I would continue just until the next section.
Okay.
Cornelius replied, 4 days ago at this very hour, at 3 o'clock, I was praying in my house when suddenly a man in dazzling clothes stood before me. He said, Cornelius, your prayer has been heard and your alms have been remembered before God. Send therefore to Joppa and ask for Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying in the home of Simon, a tanner by the sea. Therefore I sent for you immediately, and you have been kind enough to come. So now all of us are here in the presence of God to listen to all that the Lord has commanded you to say.
Okay. So, may I ask, does anybody see any educational process here? Does anybody see change happening? Or is it merely just a report of people doing what they were told?
I see Middle Eastern hospitality here.
Okay. Even though you would think that perhaps a kind of a Roman group of aristocrats, perhaps. He's got all his family and friends there, Cornelius, who must have traveled. But yeah, absolutely, his hospitality. Yeah. Going back to the Elisha Gehazi stories, especially I'm thinking of 2 Kings chapter 5, the story of Naaman, probably Naaman is probably in English, who has scaly skins and how he's cured. And it's this kind of almost comedy of errors of who's in charge. Is it the king? Is it his king? Is it the king of Israel? Is it the prophet? Is it the prophet's servant? In the end, it's the little servant girl who ends up orchestrating the whole thing. There's issues of authority and perceived authority. And the fact that he bows down to Peter and then says, no, I'm just a mortal, is on one hand shows a healthy modesty and humility of Peter, but it also shows that that's maybe in another world, maybe in the Roman world it's like that, maybe with the aristocrats it's like that. No, we're just guys. It's what Steve keeps talking about. It's this collegiality. Sorry, I forget the word in Greek, Steve.
Koinonia.
Koinonia, the koine, right? Yeah, koinonia. The koinonia here becomes the central part of what it is to be in touch with God right now, right? And Jesus isn't really in this story right now. It's about I see it at least, about being in touch with God. It's about the community. And it's not about what you eat. It's about how what you were told to eat symbolizes other things as well. So the symbolism of not eating kosher, it's not because, well, I really like lobster and I need to have those pork ribs or whatever they are because that's what I'm used to. No, it's not about that. It has a much deeper meaning. Again, I'm not going out to eat pork chops. I'm not going out to eat lobster. That's me. But I respect your freedom to do so and to understand that there's more things. What I do catch on here, and this is what I learned, especially from the Gospel of Matthew, is that so often in the normative Judaism of then, or the Pharisaic Judaism, is that the messages were lost because of the minutia of the laws themselves. The symbolism got left aside. And this paragraph beautifully brings together. It's not about bowing down to me. It's about us being here together in this community. And all of his friends came. I can just imagine a parlor meeting, right? Coming to meet the dignitary. All right, I'm talking to you.
Can you comment on something for me? You yourself know that it is improper for a Jew to associate with or visit an outsider. Is that factual in those days, that a Jew could not visit with an outsider?
Yeah, the way that a lot of, yes, first of all, it's not clear as to where motivations came from. Often people will say, what would be an example? Well, let me go to from the world of laws. The early Talmudic period, and that's oral traditions from this very time, talk about how you can't not only drink the wine of a Gentile, of a non-Jew, because originally it was perhaps suspected they used it for idolatry, but then even after that changed under Christianity, under the Christian Roman Empire much later, you still couldn't drink the wine of a Jew. I'll give you the reason in a second, but you couldn't drink the milk of a non-Jew. You couldn't eat from the baked products of a non-Jew or cooked products of a non-Jew. All this was ostensibly because maybe you can't trust that they mixed some non-kosher substance in it, but this was meant to separate Jews and non-Jews. Don't fraternize. What's the word for?
Fraternize.
Fraternize. Don't fraternize with the goyim, right? Kind of a thing. And the explicit reasons given in post-Talmudic period for not drinking non-Jewish wine. By the way, you can have non-Jewish other alcoholic substance, which is why it's a ridiculous reason, but not drinking non-Jewish wine because maybe you'll become too intimate and your children will come to marry each other. Again, I am not promoting intermarriage, but I'm certainly accepting it with open arms, those that choose that way. But so Ajit, the idea was it was separatism, very much so, yeah. But also, I said that's from our sources. On the other hand, I'm not sure how welcome Jews were in other circles, right? And that really, I'm not enough of a historian to know that. But in certain places around the world for centuries, it's not necessarily that Jews chose to be separated out. It's that others chose to separate them.
David, I loved your question that began your riff about what's the learning here? What's going on? It reminds me of hermeneutic philosophy, where it's almost a call and response. They're comparing visions and they're comparing perspectives, but at some point they begin to fuse their horizons and something new emerges between them, and that partnering, collegiality, that dialogos, that dialogue between them leads to new learning for both, so there is humility built into that openness that leads to new, fresh learning. I just think that's very, very, very cool that you asked that question.
Okay, so shall we finish off the reading? Then Stephen Bynum.
Yes.
I get it wrong every time. I'm not reading now. My glasses burn. Sorry.
Aaron, that's good.
Sorry.
34, right?
Mhm.
Is that where we're?
Yeah.
Gentiles hear the good news. Then Peter began to speak to them. I truly understand that God shows no partiality, but in every people, anyone who fears him and practices righteousness is acceptable to him. You know the message he sent to the people of Israel, preaching peace by Jesus Christ. He is Lord of all. That message spread throughout Judea, beginning in Galilee after the baptism that John announced, and how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power, how he went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. We are witnesses to all that he did, both in Judea and in Jerusalem. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree, but God raised him on the third day and allowed him to appear, not to all the people, but to us who were chosen by God as witnesses and who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. He commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one ordained by God as judge of the living and the dead. All the prophets testify about him, that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name.
Okay. Well, let me ask, why did this not come before? Why do we have to wait to this point in the narrative to have this, it's like a creed, right? It's like this story, the synopsis of what's going on in the world from a theological point of view.
I mean, to me, it's just a literary device to get to the real meat of what is trying to be said.
I tend to look for ideology in literary devices, right? And now I realize many people would say that's just the art of the narrative, but I was kind of trained to look for what might be the motivation for a particular literary device. In other words, to find meaning in the form and not just in the content.
I think it's interesting. Oh, sorry.
No, no, go ahead.
Peter starts there. It seems like there's a light has gone off in his
Mhm.
head to some degree. He says, I truly understand that God shows no partiality. And when I look at that, I'm thinking back to where we started with Cornelius, who is kind of an outsider, but he's a seeker. Cornelius is praying and giving alms, and he's trying to find God. And Peter seems to be wrapped up in his kind of his own view, and he has to be told everything 3 times before something seeks in. And now he gets to these people, and here's Cornelius got all of them here to listen to him, and he says, now I get it. God shows no partiality. And then the other part after that, where he says, anyone who fears him and practices righteousness is acceptable to him. So it's like he starts shattering barriers right there about who can approach God, or who God will approach.
And
And he needed the barriers in himself to be shattered first, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it seems like Peter saw something here, or a light went off.
Yeah, Ajit?
Verse 41, which says, not to all the people, but to us who were chosen by God as witness, essentially says that the resurrection came to be witnessed only by those who truly believed in Jesus, not by the generality of mankind. Am I correct in that reading? And it goes back to something I wrote to you, Rabbi, and to Steve, is that much of this is really important for people who actually were there at that time, and not as much for people in the future.
Steve, I'll let you answer.
Ajit, what are you asking? I mean, what's the implication of that question?
The implication of this is that the resurrection was, in fact, for those that truly believed in him, and not for the people who were there in that same general area, but it probably, they would not have seen the resurrection.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, and again, I remember the criteria for picking the replacement for Judas as someone who witnessed with us resurrection, right? So yeah, and I think that word anastasis necron, coming alive from out of dead things, it's definitely a new vision, a new understanding of who God is, as Stephen Byrne just said so eloquently. And I also think this light bulb that went off in Peter's, this aha moment, true learning. I mean, he's just penetrated to his heart, and he sees something so clearly that goes against his tradition, his practices, and it's a shocking, almost scandalous recognition, but he can't deny it. It's been confirmed over and over again. It's real. And then that leads to what's called the kerygma, right? It's that gospel narrative that talks about, you know, when Peter speaks, he summarizes the heart of that gospel message, and yes, it's rooted in resurrection. I'm not quite sure who or how that excludes others, but yeah, that's my response. Don?
I kind of am impressed with the way the message is repeated here in verse 34 to 43. It's almost like revisiting everything that happened again in a concise way at this far in the book of Acts. The thing that I think is different is all of a sudden there's forgiveness of sins through his name. I think that is kind of a different twist from the original story of Jesus.
I would say that's a sharp eye. I'm wondering if that might be seen by some to be a later addition as well. Why don't we, Eileen, would you read for us the last section today?
Sure. While Peter was still speaking, the Holy Spirit fell upon all who heard the word. The circumcised believers who had come with Peter, astounded that the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out even on the Gentiles, for they heard them speaking in tongues and extolling God. Then Peter said, "Can anyone withhold the water for baptizing these people who have received the Holy Spirit just as we have?" So he ordered them to be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. Then they invited him to stay for several days.
So for me, my first thought here was, oh, now I understand why we had that little story of the Ethiopian eunuch, right? Which is a strange story because, like, what the hell's in the middle of nowhere this is going on? And then right when he was baptized, he's whisked away, right, by an angel someplace else. In other words, there's something about that story which I was left with. It's a temporary thing. It's not a lasting. It didn't make a lasting impression. And now I understand, at least from a literary point of view, in my mind, why it was there. And it was again to show this process. There's this process of growing the community, which, going back to the beginning of our studies, we saw already was happening not only in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel, not only in Judea, not only in Jerusalem, but in the temple itself, right? In the temple itself, and the speaking of tongues and everything amongst those Jews who had been together. Slowly, it begins to permeate to all different types of Jews who were in Jerusalem for the holiday, or maybe had migrated there in different kinds of synagogues. Then it goes to Samaria. Then it goes to on the way to Gaza, on the way in that strange story. And then now we have this is what it really looks like. It's not an individual who happens to go through his own experience and by way of Judaism will I convert. It's about a group, it's about the community, and it explicitly includes Jews and Gentiles in the same group together. Also in the background, I suspect there might be competing traditions. This is in the earliest levels of the book of Acts, and I don't know enough to say this, but something tells me there might be a competition between Peter and Philip, the devotees of Philip and devotees of Peter, and this is how it comes out from it in the final version that we have of Acts. But that may be going a step too far. Reactions or comments before we throw in the towel today?
I think it's really important to note that the circumcised believers who had come with Peter were astounded. And then as we'll see when we pick up with 11 next week, the circumcised Jewish Christian believers in Jerusalem are scandalized. And so they call Peter on the carpet and say, "Give us an account." And I think in some ways Luke, and we also have it in Paul in his letter to the Romans, they're trying to, as good Jews, understand how God's kingdom includes the outsiders. Jews are already in the covenant, as Paul would put it. His focus is the outsiders, to include them in that same covenant, and that the new covenant gives them the means or the way to incorporate and enlarge the koinonia so that it becomes a universal sort of, partnering collegial truth.
Okay. Any other comments? Yes, Terry.
And maybe Stephen could answer this. Isn't this the passage that's used to justify infant baptism? And why we baptize infants? Because in Cornelius's household, it says everybody was baptized. And
yeah, I think that's one biblical justification for it, for sure. And we see that in some of, later we'll see it in Paul's journeys as well, where the whole household is included.
Okay.
Thought you just sprinkled them, Steve.
Now we Episcopalians just do a little dry cleaning,
I was making a joke, Rabbi, about Catholic Episcopalians in the old days were called Catholic Light.
I understand, but you should know in our circles, very often conservative Jews were considered to be the Episcopalians of Jews, whereas Roman Catholic were Orthodox. And when it first came down to me, the word was Unitarians or Reform, but I no longer see things in that very simplistic way.
Now they call Reform.
All right, my friends. Good to see you. I hope that I will be here next week. I have jury duty yet again, and I was able to get out of an actual trial that week because there were too many things going on. So I had to agree to come back next week, but hopefully they'll send me home. And but we'll be meeting in any case, unless of course Steve needs to go fishing or just has to absolutely go to Mexico again. You know, the poor fellow.
All
All
right.
right. See you next week.
All right, thank you, Eddie.
Rabbi Steve.
Thanks. Bye bye.